G'day, it's Jamie and welcome to Where's My Yowie. Today I'm reading an old newspaper report about a possible Yowie encounter at Cape Otway Victoria in 1847, so we'll get into it. This was published in the Sydney Chronicle on Saturday the 28th of August 1847, titled The Bunyip Out Bunyipped. In a late number of the Geelong Advertiser, a writer under the signature Monogam spins a rather tough yarn in the way of relating some adventures which he says befell upon him some days ago in the scrub on the coast near Cape Otway. Riding one day through the scrub after travelling some distance, he came to the margin of a lake and thus speaks for himself. Slowly my horse stepped to the margin of the lake. The water at his footfall rippled gently on the glistening sand. I gazed into the mysterious depths as he was drinking. My spirits felt oppressed with the perfect solitude around, when suddenly a cold, bristly hand was thrust down the back of my neck and I found myself lifted from my saddle. So sudden was the motion that my hand slipped from the rein, while my horse, gazing upwards, snorted with terror and dashed back upon the track he came. After being lifted a considerable height and dragged roughly forward for some distance, I was thrown upon my back in a hollow upon a huge branch, which must have been formed by the wet getting into some fracture and causing a partial decay of the wood. I now saw, to my surprise and terror, the cause of the sudden change of position. A huge animal, nearly corresponding to the orang of the Eastern Archipelago, was leaning over me, all his hands grasping the tree firmly. I struggled to raise myself into a posture of defence, when opening his huge gape, he seized me across the face and placing his hot tongue upon my lips, sucked my breath to such an extent as to throw me into a dreadful torture. I fancy I feel his canine teeth even now pressing upon my cheek, and my lungs collapsing with the deep inspirations of the monster. Instinctively I ceased struggling, my efforts being worse than useless. Upon finding me resist no longer, he seized me in the same manner as before and lugged me further still up into the tree. Stopping on an enormous bough nearly over the middle of the deep water, here he raised himself to his full height, which must have been over 8 feet, rising me with his left arm and suddenly planting me on the limb beside him. My feet slipped from under me and I sank on my knees. I was unable to maintain my equilibrium and I fell, clinging to the tree with my hands, expecting every moment to drop into the gloomy depth beneath. Every second seemed now to me an hour, for I never expected to rise again. Slowly, the monster, as though seeing my exhausted state, lowered one of his hinder hands and, catching me by the belt, threw me over and over into an opposite fork as a man might throw a dead rabbit. The force with which I struck the branch hurt me severely, yet I felt relieved at being rescued from the predicament in which I had been placed. I now endeavoured to place myself in a secure position, but while doing so, my neckerchief caught on a projecting twig in such a manner as to compel me to loosen it. The monster, who had been eyeing me steadfastly from the opposite bough, perceived me replace the kerchief, and swinging himself to where I sat, took it away from me and returned to his original position. There, squatting on his hams, he placed it around his neck, giving me an opportunity to observe his horrid features as he endeavoured to see the kerchief beneath his bristly beard. A thunder shower now rattled through the creaking branches. Peal after peal reverberated among the dismal ranges. while one broad flash seemed to make all nature flinch again. All this time the monster sat scarcely moving a muscle, only once taking his eye off me to grin ferociously at the lurid glare. The rain, which poured in copious streams from his wiry coat, had completely saturated my jacket, making it so heavy that I knew it would completely cripple me in the event of a last struggle. I therefore determined to remove it, and did so, hanging it on a neighbouring branch. This motion evidently attracted the attention of the orang, but he did not move. I had now had time to consider my position, and it seemed evident to me that if I was to get away at all, it must be by stratagem. The sun was now falling, throwing long shadows on the distant hills. The mists of evening already whitened the bottom of those deep gullies. The air too began to grow cold, and as I feared to move, I felt it much. I now dropped all idea of using force, even in the last extremity, and assumed that the covering I so much needed. No sooner had I put my arms into my jacket than the orang bounded towards me and seated himself within arm's length, examined me minutely. He first seized my jacket, and I thought he would have taken my arms with it, but by a dexterous twist I disengaged myself. He then seized my cap, which was a sou'wester. I quickly untied the string which it was secured, and he placed it on his own head, but as fortune would have it, the wrong side before. I immediately saw that this would impede his vision, and saw my advantage. I offered gently to tie the string, which rather coyly he permitted. He now seemed to think that I would come to pieces altogether, for seizing me by the hair, he took out a handful. However, that much satisfied him. He then seized me by the waistband of my trousers, and as they were of strong texture, he soon assured me that if I did not release myself, I should have my back broken. I therefore reluctantly removed them, which seemed greatly to astonish him. I laid them by me, and his attention now seemed turned to myself. The broad flap of the sou'wester seemed to annoy him by falling over his eyes, but at the last he made it lay over the back of his forehead, when he made a figure I shall scarcely forget, but though grotesque, never to be remembered by me without a shudder. I now hoped he was satisfied with his inspection, and began to put on my trousers, but this seemed just what he wanted, for I had no sooner put them on than he had them off again, and thrusting his enormous feet through them, endeavoured to pull them up, but as they were certainly never made for such proportions, this would not do. Finding his efforts useless, he balanced himself well on the branch, and began to put on my jacket. This he did to admiration as to one of the sleeves, but the other one for some minutes bothered him much. Waving it backwards and forwards on one arm, he twisted it once or twice, and at last got his hand firmly into the other sleeve. A sudden puff of wind blew the cap of the sou'wester over his eyes. I saw the chance, and drawing my fist to my shoulder with the energy of despair, I gave him a crack under the ear and sent him roaring into the water below. How I descended the tree I cannot say, but I reached the ground in safety, and there being light enough, I took to the track my horse had twice passed. Fear added my wings to speed, and after tearing along for about half a mile, I found my horse stopped by the bridle catching on a fallen tree. Here, in all probability, he would have soon starved had I not been rescued in so singular a manner. After this, he got home safely to his hut, and so ends this monster story. It is unnecessary to say that we cannot imagine any person so absurd as to believe one word of this Baron Munchausen rigmarole. It is, however, a good twister, and, only for its clumsiness, would do honour to the inventive genius of the writer. We would advise him not to lose much time in favouring the public with his adventure number 2, the end. That's a pretty interesting story. I don't know whether this story is fact or fiction. I think it's fiction, but I just don't know. Some of the descriptions that he said about the Yowie in this story is pretty accurate and spot on. And it's back in 1847, when, years ago. I don't know whether this guy saw one or not, or had this adventure or not. I have no idea. It's a bit outrageous, some of the stuff, with it trying to put the jacket on and the pants on and the hat on. But whether it's fact or fiction, I don't know. But one thing I've learned about Yowies is when you think you've heard it all, you'll hear something more that'll just blow you away. Okay, that's it from me. I'll get back to this all next time. Bye.